Hi, welcome. This video is part 2 of 2, where I'm talking about improving our thinking and our sense-making skills. And this is actually near the end of a long series about simplicity and complexity. So let's go ahead and jump in. Just to orient ourselves here, in these modern times, we are being asked to navigate and make sense out of an increasingly complex world, while we are being hampered by our inherent cognitive biases, and those biases are being manipulated by all sorts of nefarious and profit-seeking sources. It's hard, but nonetheless, sense-making is foundationally important for us to be an active participant in this or any democracy. Apparently, because it's a democracy, we're in charge of this whole thing. So we need to make sure that we are improving our thinking skills. Now, I bet that you think that you already know how to think, and truth is, I bet that you're probably pretty good at it. In fact, you wouldn't be watching this video unless thinking was something that you were really into. So that said, it turns out that critical thinking isn't something that many of us are taught. So let's get into thinking about how we can get better at thinking. And if only because we can and it's fun, so let's give it a try. So first of all, what do I mean by better in this case? Now, the search for truth, so I'm going to think about this in two parts. One is the search for truth is like moving towards a vanishing point that's off on the horizon. Truth is out there, and it's a way for us to orient ourselves, but we're not actually going to get to perfection. But we can definitely keep improving, and this is a journey that we all need to be traveling on and traveling together, and at least just remembering to orient ourselves, at least knowing that that's where we're trying to go. We're trying to really make sense out of the world. And it's also about kind of understanding the spectrum of like having sort of clear, reasonable understanding of the world, and then recognizing that it's kind of complex and foggy and actually blurry thing, versus kind of a lesser form of thinking or less adequate way of thinking would be to have this like really kind of blurry, distorted vision, but that kind of makes the world look nice and simple and easy. The truth is the world is complex, and if we're thinking that everything's really simple, then we're probably falling suspect to cognitive biases. If you're curious about that, there's a lot of videos about that I've made already. So I'm going to share some tools and perspectives that are useful to me. And this model serves as a point of reference like almost all the time when I'm in conversation with someone. It makes me think about the way I'm thinking, and it helps me kind of understand maybe how other people are thinking. And we're going to use as a model stuff from Tim Urban. He is the creator of Wait But Why, and this will be our guide for today, and this will be sort of all the images and stuff that I'm going to be showing you are for him today. So let's look and see what we got. So, Tim Urban created, this is Wait But Why. He makes this great blog, and he has this series called The Story of Us, and it is absolutely one of my favorite pieces of literature out there in the world. And it has, 10 different chapters here with a nice little intro chapter, and the whole thing is basically, he started asking, like, what's the problem with the world? Why is everything so crazy? And he does deep investigations into things, and so this whole thing is a super thorough and interesting investigation into what's going on with the world. And we today are going to zoom in on chapter 7 here, the thinking ladder. And I don't know, if you like learning and thinking and taking in information, come check out all of his other posts. He has stuff about artificial intelligence and the Fermi paradox, and then like how to pick a life partner, and how to name your baby, why you should stop caring what other people think. Okay, anyways, really cool stuff. Tim Urban's awesome. you should check it out. But today we're going to focus on the thinking ladder. Now, the thinking ladder is basically kind of two different spectrums here. And how you think is where we're going to be focusing on. And we're going to be looking at 4 different ways of thinking. Now, so Tim has a 4-part model. And what you'll see here is that there is 2 spectrums. One is what we think, and the other one is how we think. Now, what we think is basically like the whole spectrum of belief systems and so forth. And any of us, whether on the left or the right or wherever we're coming from, we all are susceptible to different qualities in our thinking. So we're going to focus on this vertical axis here on how we think. He covers this a lot more in earlier parts, but basically this little orange ball here is what he calls the primitive mind. And the primitive mind is focused on things like survival and hunger and thirst and reproduction and aggression and pain and fear. And then this other guy up here is what he calls the higher mind. And the higher mind is basically our reason. It's our empathy. It's our imagination. And we basically work on a spectrum from being controlled by our primitive mind, which is just trying to keep us alive and get what we want, and the higher mind, which is the one that's kind of caring and thoughtful and tries to make sense out of the world. And this is, again, where the sort of the clear eyes at the top and then the foggy eyes down at the bottom. Now, who are these 4 different levels here? So first is thinking like a scientist. Thinking like the scientist is someone who wants to know the truth and is actually willing to be wrong and be corrected and face dissent, and because they care about the truth, they're willing to be corrected. The sports fan is the next one there. Now, the sports fan has a really strong preference about a certain outcome. They really want their team to be the best, but they'll follow the rules of the game and they'll accept reality when they have to be faced with it. But they really want a certain outcome to happen. And so in our thinking, that could just really be like someone who wants to, like, I really think this should be true, but okay, I'm willing to recognize that that might not be true. Now, the attorney is the next one, and the attorney is someone who's going to only accept one outcome. They're driving to one outcome, and they're going to advocate for it, but they will follow the rules of thinking, but they're going to select the evidence that is going to support their perspective and will help others kind of get to their outcome. So they do have a sense that we need to sort of follow the rules and have some coherent line of thinking, but they're going to really try to direct us in one direction. And then the last guy down in there with the little hat is the zealot. And the zealot is someone who is committed to a certain belief, and they don't really care about having any evidence to support it. Then they're not going to be dissuaded by new information because they believe in the truth that they want to believe in. So then we're going to try to think like a scientist. And so today we'll talk about what does it mean to think like a scientist. So let's talk a little bit about the scientific method. Now, the scientific method, this is Tim's approach to the scientific method. The idea is that we're starting with point A, and we're trying to get to B. So we're starting with an idea, a question, something we're curious about, and then we're trying to get to a place where we have like a clear understanding of what is going on. Now, the scientific process is basically a process where we are observing the world, we ask a question about something that we're curious about. And then we're going to go gather some information, we're going to do some research, and then we're basically at that point going to form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is sort of what we think might be happening here. And then we're going to do some hypothesis testing, and we're going to do experiments to test the hypothesis. And then we're going to get some data and some results, and then we'll see, well, does it confirm the hypothesis? If not, then we'll go back to the hypothesis formation. Or if it does, then maybe our hypothesis is true. Then we might even go and seek out dissent, and we might ask other people, hey, does this make sense? Can you prove it wrong? And if the data matches and no one can tell you any reason why it's not true, then we might be able to arrive at a theory or a belief. And so here's how we can really think about this process in a different way that, again, I appreciate. So we are out, this is kind of a way of sort of thinking about our mind. So there's the outside world there in the white, and then we allow things to pass through the intention gate. So things we're paying attention to, and then those are the things that we're willing to consider. And then we'll have the belief gate, and if things can pass our belief gate, then they become beliefs for us. And I just, again, appreciate the way he thinks. So you can think about us at each of our gates as having like a bouncer. And the bouncer's job is to sort of decide what am I going to allow to come in or not into my ways of thinking. And there actually is a bit of like a spectrum here. Now, we can either have a really wide open filter, so we're just going to take in all the information that we want. We're just going to keep on listening and listening and listening. Or we're going to have which is in a certain way being a little more gullible, or we're going to have a really tight trust filter. And that's kind of the paranoid and skepticism. And what we're really aiming for is this like sweet spot in the middle. So we want to kind of not be too gullible, not be too skeptical, but we're going to try to find that kind of rationally skeptical sweet spot there in the middle. So just a couple thoughts about how we can take in information. At the scientist way of thinking is actually wanting to take in a lot of information at the beginning. When it's like, what am I going to pay attention to? I actually don't want to focus too much too early on what I'm thinking about, what I'm going to consider. So just some thoughts about how we can be open and curious. So if you're wondering about an issue and you go to do some research on it, you might very quickly find something that confirms your way of thinking. And you're like, okay, cool. Is that enough information? This is something that's called the makes sense stopping rule. So like, okay, well, it looks like the top search in my Google confirmed what I was thinking, but guess what? Google already knows how you think and they're trying to play with you. So actually keep digging. And some ways of doing that are just like diversifying your information sources, diversifying your media diet, as I talked about in the last video. And another way to think about this is see if you can find a counter argument. See if you can find someone who's willing to say kind of the opposite of what you're saying. And again, we want to sort of like be always trying to figure out like, okay, we don't want to take in too much information, but we want to take up in a lot of information when you're trying to understand the world. You should be considering a lot of different perspectives. Some other ways to think about this is talking to other people, listening to others, and asking questions. Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about the idea of signal versus noise. So noise is all the fluff, intentional efforts to bias you. But then there's signal. There's actually real information. And Schmachtenberger calls the rule omega is to assume that there's always some signal whenever someone's saying. There's probably some truth in what people are saying, or at least there's some reason for them to be saying what they're saying. So finding the signal in the noise is really important. And this is where it's useful to get curious and ask questions, and also to remember that cognitive bias is real. So that's something for you to think about for yourself, but then also to notice like, oh, this person might just be oversimplifying things or, taking shortcuts in their thinking. So once we've taken in a bunch of information, we're considering a lot of information early on. Then we're going to try to figure out what are we going to allow into our belief gate. Now, this bouncer, we want to have be a lot more strict. Only the choicest information is going to come in here. And so here's some ways that your bouncer might sort of check. So one is get references. Tell other people about your idea. Tell about your theory or what you're thinking about and say, hey, I heard this. Does this make sense? Find someone who has some experience around it. Find some people who have lived experience. Get feedback on the things that you're thinking about. Now, if we're asking other people, there's a couple things to remember about who should we trust and why. Because, again, there's way too much information out there. So whether I'm going to listen to this or that, or this expert or that expert, there's a couple considerations on thinking about who might be the best people to trust. So one is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect, again, I spoke about this in an earlier video, but it's the fact that people who know very little about something tend to have a lot of confidence about it. And people who know a lot, people who are really expert about something, they will tend to give caveats and say, well, we don't totally know everything yet. So if someone is really confident about what they're saying and they're sure that it's the truth, you might be more skeptical about that person. And if someone is speaking with a lot of caveats and nuance, then you might assume that they actually really know what they're talking about. Another thing to consider as like who we're trusting and why, especially when we're getting opinions of people around us, is that, as a concept I talked about before, is that there's a cultural magnet. So the people around us, we will tend to think like them, and they want to sort of they will tend to believe what the other people around them believe. And so if you're ask people who are around you and they confirm your beliefs, and because their friends are confirming their beliefs, you might sort of be stuck in a bit of a groupthink. So it's worth noticing, is this person believing this or thinking this way because that's what everyone around them, the way they're thinking? Or have they actually thought about it and considered good data and done their scientific process effort? And I think that's important also because if you are trying to take in new information and try to maybe change the way you understand something or really curiously trying to find the truth, you might be fighting against the stream. You might be needing to, the people around you might disagree with you. And so, ask other people, get feedback, but be thoughtful about how you do that. And the other thing that I think is interesting is like, how can I actually check my biases, right? Like, how do we check our biases? And one little rule of thumb that I have is that if I get a new piece of information and I say, ooh, yeah, that feels really good, and it seems really simple, and now everything's really clear to me, that's a cue for you to actually maybe go, why do I like this? If it feels good, it might be too simple, or it might just be confirming something that you already wanted to hear. So, taking in new information means being open to being a little challenging sometimes. And there's a quote or a concept that I really enjoy is that the idea of disillusionment. So if you're actually feeling disillusioned, you're like disappointed, like, oh my gosh, I always thought this, but now I'm realizing that that's not true. Disillusionment is the undoing of the illusion, and that should be something that we can celebrate. So the other thing that I would just say about testing your ideas and trying to see how deeply you want to let them into your beliefs is when you live according to your belief or your theory or your understanding of the world, are you getting good results? And it's really worthwhile for you to update your knowledge when you get new data. So if it's hard and you're running into resistance and you keep on getting yourself into trouble when you sort of act based on your beliefs, then you probably should question whether or not that's the most accurate way of thinking. And as we try to sort of consciously manage our knowledge, this makes it a lot easier to sort of take in new information because we can say, oh, right, that's right. I started thinking about this because of this reason. Now I heard this. Now I can take in something new. And so what we're really aiming for here is something that he calls the humility sweet spot. Now, the idea is that you want to find this dance between really, as you get to know more, you can have more conviction about it. If you don't know that much, you shouldn't have that much, you should have less conviction. And if we have kind of more conviction than our knowledge, this is kind of where we get arrogant. And of course, if we have, less less conviction than our knowledge, or we know more than we're actually willing to convict. And this is a bit about that Dunning-Kruger effect. So humility, I think, is really an important theme here. This came up in the series on, personal development. But one way to sort of think about having humility is to actually just be really honest about what you know and what you don't know. So you can say, hey, this is a hypothesis that I'm working with. This is something that I'm working with. I actually haven't done the research on this. Or say things like, as far as I know, this seems to be true. Or based on the research that I did last week, this is what I believe. Another way to think about your beliefs is to sort of say, I believe in this 80%. The other 20%, I don't quite understand yet. And I often find myself useful to, if I'm saying something that kind of seems like, wow, I'm not really sure if that's true or not, I will really say that out loud. I'll just say, you know what, I actually don't know where I heard this. And, I've been holding this thought for a long time, and, it might not be totally accurate, but let me just make sure you understand that before I say anything. So I am going to give us a little recap here before we wrap up. And then we're going to have a little bonus segment about science and the scientific method. So here's our recap. So thinking ladder. All right. So we have kind of the scientist, the sports fan, the attorney, or the zealot. They're living on a spectrum from using their rational mind, higher mind, that focuses on reason and empathy and imagination and creativity, versus the primitive mind, which is really focusing on survival and just making sure that you're safe and all that, which is, of course, very reasonable, but we need to keep them in balance with each other. Now, the idea here is we will focus on truth, and we actually will, truth is the most important thing, and we kind of care less about having to be confirmed right. The sports fan would love, want something to be true, and, would like some confirmation, kind of angling for it, but is still truth is most important. The attorney would like to have their confirmation of what they believe and kind of understands the importance of truth. And the zealot, they only care about being confirmed in what they believe. And truth is something they find to be really less important there. And you can see that here, starting at A, the scientist is willing to go anywhere. The sports fan, starting at A, they would like to get to here, but they're willing to have other outcomes happen. Attorney, many paths to find to get to the outcome that they want. And the zealot, all they really know is just their outcome is really the only important thing. And so that means they're going to use, broad, unbiased info gathering. Sports fans will do some cherry picking. The attorney gets really good at cherry picking, and the zealot doesn't really need any new information. The spectrum here is, are we in a search for truth, or are we in a search for the comfort of having certainty about the world? And again, here's our little evaluating info piece, and the scientist is in that sweet spot. Their only important question to them is it true? And they'll take on any information, but they're just trying to figure out if it's true or not. And then the spectrum is, you know, the kind of higher on the global if it's confirming what you want. And if it's dissent, then you feel pretty skeptical about it. And I think that that is a nice place for us to sort of wrap this piece up, is that we are looking at the world and there's all this information. And one of the best little barometers inside of our hearts is, yeah, it makes me feel good. That confirms what I believe. Or is it kind of challenging dissent, noticing that if your question is something other than, is it true? And then you're probably getting skewed by wanting to have the world be the way you want it to be, as opposed to actually trying to find out what's going on in the world. So I am going to come back with some caveats about science and the scientific process, because, you know, truth is that scientists are human, and that means that they're also subject to bias. And guess what? Science isn't real, and it's actually not right. It's just a process. And so stay tuned for caveats on science and the scientific process. Thank you for wanting to think better and thinking about thinking with me. I hope you've enjoyed this. And again, check out Tim Urban. He's really dope. And have a good day.